Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show you how you can set up fade out and fade in transitions for your Godot game. And as a option, you can also have a scene to load once your fade out animation is complete. So let me go ahead and set the load scene over here, and let's replay the game real quick. And this time when we fade out, you'll see that it will switch to a scene once the fade out animation is complete. So in your Godot project, we're going to start by creating a new scene to create our transition UI. So let's add a new scene to the project. We'll use user interface as our base root node, and I'm going to rename this to be transitions. So under transitions, I'm going to need at a minimum two different nodes. One is going to be the texture rect node. So add the texture rect node. This is where we're going to create our circle texture. You can also bring in any image into Godot and have it render on a texture rect as well. So let's create that. And then later, to actually animate the properties on this texture rect, we'll need an animation player. So I'll right click on the transitions node, add child, and search for animation player. Okay, so let's click on the texture rect node, and the first thing we're going to need to set up is the texture. So if we click on the drop down for texture in the inspector, you'll see there's a bunch of different options here. If you just want to use a image like a JPEG or PNG, you can start by using a image texture. But in this tutorial, I'm actually going to be using a gradient texture 2D, because without actually bringing in an image, we can just create a circle right inside of Godot. So let's do a new gradient texture 2D, and you should see the default black to white, left to right transition. So click on the texture in the inspector, and let's change a few settings here. First, go to fill, and we're going to change it from linear fill to radial. Then up here at the top near the picture of the gradient, there's a grid option here. So if we toggle grid snap, it'll make it very easy to edit the handles on our gradient. So the one in the top left, if we bring that to the center, just snapping it there to 0.5, 0.5, then you'll see that this now looks like a circle. Now, as per our standard gradient, it's going to blur between those two values, but we actually want it to be either completely on or completely off for our transition. So I'm going to click on the gradient colors area, and on interpolation mode, let's change it from linear to constant. So after setting the interpolation mode to constant, you'll see that the image goes completely black. We need to take the white color notch and pull this over to the left a bit until we can see a black circle appear on our screen. So what we actually want to do is not have a square, but we want to make all of these white pixels transparent. So double click on the white color notch and then take the alpha and just set it to 0. So now if we go back out, you'll see that in our scene view and in the gradient preview that we have a circle shape. So we can scale this up or down. If you don't like the exact placement of the pixels here, then you can move the notch a little bit more, and that'll change it. So when I move it a little bit more to the right, you can see that the top, left, bottom, and right has 4 pixels on the edge here for the circle, so it looks a little better. And now how we're going to have our transition is that we scale the texture up or down depending on if we're fading in or fading out. But right now, if we were to scale the texture, which I could do by hitting S and then pulling on one of the sides, you'll see that it's actually scaling from this top left point, not the center of the circle. So I'm going to hit Control Z a couple times in order to revert it back. And we want to go down to the layout of the control, expand transform, and then you'll see the size of the texture rect. It defaults to 64 by 64, and then down here we have the pivot offset. So the pivot is at position 0, 0, which is the top left-hand corner. We want to move it to the center, so we need to move it halfway to the right and halfway down. So for a size of 64, 64, that's going to mean 32 for the X pivot and 32 for the Y pivot. Put those numbers in, and you should see the scale handles now go to the center of the circle. So if we scale it up now, it's going to be scaling from wherever its center point is. So now we should go to the animation player and create some animations. So let's click on the animation drop down, new animation, and let's start by doing a fade out. So new animation name fade out. For the properties, I'm going to add 2. So click on the drop down property track, texture rect, and let's get scale. You can type it in or just look for it. So the scale property open, and that adds it to our animation graph down here. Add track, property track. We're still doing the texture rect, and I want to search for visible. So add that in. So when our animation is going, we want our texture to be visible. but if the animation hasn't started yet, we might actually want the texture to be invisible until we need it in our game. So let's right click, insert a key for visibility, and just make sure that it is visible at the start of our animation here with the checkbox value on. And then for scale, well, we're going to be fading out. So for our fade out, the screen turns completely black. So at the start of our animation, the texture should be very, very small. So let's right click and insert a key for scale at the 0 point. And then for value, we can change its value to something like 0.1, 0.1, hit enter. If you move the timeline cursor a bit, then you should see the new size as it actually changes to that scale. So now we need to go to 1 second in, or however long you need your animation to be. You can extend your animation over here on the right. Right click, insert a key, click here, and I'm going to change the value to 2525 for the scale, but you can use whatever numbers you want. So now if you move to here, you'll see that the image is now gigantic, and at the start, it's very tiny. So between those values, it's going to animate. So go to frame 0, hit play, and you'll roughly see what the animation is going to look like. Of course, when you're actually in game, it's going to be covering the screen. This space here, where it has 25 scale, is actually much bigger than the screen itself. So we'll have to see how that goes in game. And next, take the animation, and we're just going to duplicate it. And I'm going to make this fade in. So with the fade in animation, which it automatically switches to, we're just going to reverse the values of the scale. So I'm just going to take these keyframe points and swap them. So now 25 scale at the start and a 0.1 scale at the end. Now also, when our fade in is done, I want to completely disable this texture Rex visibility. So let's insert a key for visibility and toggle that off. So now if we go to 0 and hit play, you should see that it is not visible at the end of this fade in animation. So let's save our transition scene now in our project. I'll hit Control S. UI folder would be a decent place to put it, so let's try that, and I'll save it into here. So back in our main game level, we want to add the transition scene here as well. So because we want the UI to move with our player moving across the screen, basically staying in the same visible position, no matter where our character is in the game level, we want to add another child node to test level. So I'm going to right click on our level, add child node, and I believe it's called canvas layer. So we want canvas layer here, create, and this will keep the positions of things on the screen under it in the same spot that it starts in. So if we take transitions.tscn and put it under here, okay, and make sure it is a child of the canvas layer, you might need to drag and drop it again, then it should keep its position. To quickly show that the transitions is in fact there, let's go to the transitions, and you can toggle the visibility here to make sure it's on. Save the scene, go to the test level, and we should see the transitions texture rect right here. But we do want to make sure that this does not be there when the game starts. So, of course, if you go back to the transition scene, you can disable it here, and that's okay. But we could also add in script that just whenever this object starts in the game, we just make sure that it is actually off in code. So let's create a simple script for our transitions node. So I'm going to go to script in the inspector, new script, transitions.gd is fine. So I'll create that. And I'll also give this script a class name of transitioner so that we can easily reference it in other scripts, which we'll do in a minute. And what we want to do when our script starts is to disable the visibility of the texture rect. So let's, under the class name, add in @onReady var. Let's say animation text, which is a type of texture rect, and we're going to assign that to equals $texture rect. So it'll take the texture rect that's in this hierarchy, assign this to the variable when the script starts, which means we can just come in here to the ready function and do animation text dot visible equals false. So whenever the script starts, then the animation texture should be invisible. We're not going to need this process delta function, so I will just cut that out and hit save. Now let's go back to the text level. In 2D mode, I want to add a little toggle button, which we can use in order to tell the transitioner whether we are trying to play the fade out or the fade in animation. So under canvas layer, right click, add a child node, and let's do button. So we're going to want the check button option here, create. And of course, in your actual game, you'd have And of course, in your actual game, you'd probably have a different trigger for telling the game when to call the transition animations, but this will just work for the tutorial pretty well. So in our check button, we're going to add a new script. So I will call this to be transition button, I suppose, for now. Create. And also rename the button in the hierarchy to be transition button. And let's rename transitions to be transitioner. And I'll also do the same thing inside of the transition scene. So transitioner, since that's the name I went with. And then lastly, let's also rename the script and the scene. So the script name, transitioner, and then the script name, transitioner. Okay, so now in transition button, let's get reference to our transitioner script that's in our test level scene. So we're going to assign that directly in the inspector, so we can do that with @export var, and let's call this transitioner of type transitioner. So this is the class name we set up in the other script. When we set up the class name, then we can be sure that when we're setting the variable in the inspector that it is of this class type. So that just helps us to check and make sure we're using the right thing. So let's get rid of these functions down here. And for the transition button, I'm going to click on that, go to node. So under node, we have a signal toggled, which we can use whenever the button is toggled on or off. We can tell something like our transitioner to, let's say, change the animation to fade in or fade out. So double click on toggled and connect the transition button signal to the transition button. So I'm going to connect that right here. And we're going to pass this button pressed, which is a on-off Boolean, into the transitioner. So in the transitioner script, we can have a function where we'll tell it which animation to play. We could call it something like set next animation. And this could take a Boolean, let's say we'll call it fading out. And if the Boolean fading out is set to true, then obviously we want to fade out. So our transitioner is going to need to get access to the animation player now. So if we look at our transitioner scene, you can see the animation player, we can get that right here the same way we did the texture rect. So I'll do @onReady var animation player of type animation player. It's going to be equal to $animation player. Okay, so with this animation player that we have now, we can do animation player dot, we could either do play, which would interrupt the current animation, but I think a slightly better way would be to queue up the next animation. So we'll do animation player dot queue, which means we wait for the current animation to be finished before we play the next animation, and we're going to queue up the fade out animation. Okay, otherwise, we can come down here and do animation player dot queue, and we'll just say fade in. Since this is just a simple example, there's only two possibilities that check mark can give us. So just for the sake of simplicity, we'll do it like this. So let's go back to our main scene now, the test level, and we want to assign the transitioner. So we can see the spot for it in the transition button GD part of the inspector. So you can hit assign, find the transitioner in the scene, double click it, and now it's assigned. One other thing I want to change about this transition button is that by default, if you click on a button on the UI, it will focus on that button, but I do not want this button to be focused, because if you have a button focused, then other UI actions like the space bar might actually trigger that button. I only want to be able to press this one with the mouse. So to change that, go to Control Focus and change mode to none. This way it can't be focused on, you can only click on it. So let's hit play now and see where we're at. So we have the button up here in the top left corner. Because of the canvas layer, it keeps its position in the right spot. Let's hit the checkbox and see if it plays anything for the animation. Okay, so it currently does not. Okay, and that's of course because I forgot to tell the transition button script to actually set the animation in the transitioner. So on toggled, we want to do transitioner dot, let's see, set next animation, and we're going to just pass in the button pressed value. And that should be all we need there, I think. So let's hit play. Let's hit check on the button. Okay, and we can toggle it off and on. So our fade animation is basically working correctly there. But we do want to offset where it's playing exactly inside of our scene. So let's go back to our transitioner scene, and we can see the base node here, the transitioner, basically as the frame of our window here. If we click on the texture rect, we can see this, the center area for this is in the top left corner, which is where it was playing the animation from. So you actually kind of want to just center this So I think we might be able to just go down to, let's say, layout mode, and we can change layout mode from position to anchors, and anchors preset, we'll do center. So now this is going to keep our text direct in the center of our parent, which is the transitioner root node. Okay, cool. Let's also toggle off the visibility there, go to play mode, toggle it on and off, and we can see that now it is actually playing from the center of our screen, which is what we were looking for. Now, if you think that the animation plays way too fast, which I do, then you can go to the animation player, change the scale values for the start and end from the 25 value to 10, okay, and just make sure that that is linking the X, Y values together so it stays consistent as a circle. Go to fade out and do the same thing for the values, just change the 25 to 10. If you hit play now, then it's going to look slower because it's going to a much smaller final value. So this might be a lot more appropriate for your scene. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, so lastly, what I want to do for this tutorial is just make it so that when you do the fade out animation, if you have a scene that you want to switch to, then you can have the transitioner automatically switch. So let's jump into the transitioner scene. And when animation player is done playing the animation, we want to see which animation played. So if it's the fade out animation, then we want to switch scenes. So under animation player, go to node and then do animation finished. Double click on the signal, connect it to the transitioner script, connect. So now we have this function written down here, and we want to check if the animation name matches the scene switch name. So let's go up here to the top and do a export var, and I'll say scene switch anim, which is a type of string, and I'll just default this to be fade out. So it doesn't have to be fade out. You could do it on a fade in as well. It's just that when the animation name matches whatever we have in this variable that's set up here because of the export var, then it will switch the animation. So to do that, first off, we need to check if the animation name passed into the function from the signal equals the scene switch animation name. And then we have to have a scene to actually switch to. So let's add another export var at export var, and let's say scene to load, which is going to be a packed scene as in a scene that is in the file system assets of your project. And we don't have a default value for that. So we want to check if the scene to load is actually valid. So add that to the if part of your signal callback here. If scene to load does not equal null, and animation name equals the scene switch animation. Add a colon at the end so that it is a proper if line. And then we need to actually tell it what to do after the if. So that's going to be get tree. So we get the currently active scene tree, and then we tell it to switch the scene to something else. So we do get tree as a function, and then we do change scene to packed, and the packed scene is scene to load. Okay. So save all of that, and you should see the packed scene field pop up here in the scene to load. So if we don't have scene to load set, then this is going to be null, and this part will never trigger. So you'll only need to set the scene if you actually want it to switch to a new scene. So for instance, if I go back and I hit play a couple times, you'll see that it doesn't do anything, but it also does an error out. So let's create a fake scene that we can switch to real quick. I'll go to scene, new scene. Let's make it a 2D scene. And let's look at 2D view. I'll add a couple texture vecs to this node 2D so that we have something to see in the scene. So I'll right click, add child node, texture rect, and let's change the texture to a canvas texture. I'll hit W to go to move mode, position it somewhere we can see it, Control D to make a new one, position it, Control D to make a new one. And we can change the color on one or two of them by clicking on them, going down to texture under canvas item, or maybe it's visibility actually. So visibility, and then we can do self-modulate to change its own color. So let's change it to something else, lower the white value and then give it a color value. Click on texture 3, visibility, self-modulate, bring this value down and change it to another color. Okay, now we need to save this scene in our project so it actually is a valid packed scene. Let's go out and maybe I'll create a test scenes folder in this project or something. So I'll just say test scenes. Okay. Let's rename this scene to be fake scene, I suppose. Hit save. Now in our transitioner, we can set the default scene to load, or if you don't want to have a default, we could just go to the test level and set it here. So if you reuse the transitioner for different levels in your game, and maybe you're switching to different levels from each transitioner, then you can just have this value set for each instance of the transitioner. So let's find the level under test scenes, drag in faked scene to scene to load, pop that in there. So now if we hit play and we fade out, let's see if it loads the new scene, and it does. And as soon as we remove the scene to load and hit play, then it just goes back to being a normal fade out and fade in. So that's basically how you can do a very simple fade out, fade in animation, and how you can switch scenes when those animations are complete inside of Godot. So I've been Chris. Thanks for watching this tutorial to the end, and hopefully I'll see all of you in my future Godot game content.